Hello, my name is Flavia Forte, and today I will be discussing the barriers to accessing couples counselling for LGBTQ and ethnic minorities. So what is couples counselling? Well, it is a psychological intervention which is specifically designed for couples to improve communication, resolve conflict, and generally strengthen the relationship, amongst other things. And there is plenty of empirical evidence that supports its effectiveness across a range of difficult issues in relationships. However, unfortunately, these services are not equally distributed across all populations, and some marginalised groups, especially LGBTQ individuals and people from diverse ethnic groups, face disproportionate barriers in accessing and engaging with couples therapy. There is also a gap in the research. Existing research on couples counselling has mainly focused on couples that were white and heterosexual, and this can create a limited and potentially biased evidence base when it relates to its effectiveness. While there are some studies that do explore LGBTQ couples and cultural barriers independently, there is still a lack of research which examines the intersectionality between these two groups. And this absence reflects a broader neglect of intersectionality within psychological research. The aim for this study is to explore barriers in accessing couples counselling amongst people who are both LGBTQ and non-white. It seeks to understand how these overlapping identities can shape the experiences in accessing and engaging in couples counselling. The aim is also for this study to contribute in the development of more inclusive and intersectionally informed understandings of therapy accessibility. So, on to the methods. The study recruited 9 participants who identified as both LGBTQ and who also were from an ethnic minorities, and they were recruited through purposive volunteer sampling via social media platforms. The interviews lasted between 45 and 60 minutes, and they included both open and close-ended questions. The questions explored participants' understanding of what couples counselling was, their experiences, and their perceived barriers. The study uses a qualitative research design to allow for more in-depth exploration of these people's lived experiences. It also uses semi-structured design to explore participants' perceptions, attitude, and personal accounts while still giving the conversation a sense of direction. This design offers a flexible structures which allowed participants to elaborate on their issues most relevant to their lived experiences. After the interviews were completed, they were analysed using Braun and Clark's 6-phase thematic analysis, which involved coding, finding the themes, and refining the themes by cross-referencing them between researchers to hopefully enhance the credibility and reduce bias. So on to the results. The themes that were found were cultural barriers, LGBTQ specific barriers, and intersectional barriers. Cultural barriers were spoken about by 7 out of 9 participants. In their interviews, the participants discussed several cultural barriers that have prevented them or discouraged them from accessing couples counselling, and we'll be talking about them in the sub-themes. The first sub-theme is family/cultural traditions and pressures. As you can see from the quotes, this sub-theme shows how family, tradition, and cultural influence can reduce people's willingness to access couples counselling. The reluctance to discuss counselling with family suggests shame, secrecy, and stigma, which reinforces the idea that counselling is still very taboo in certain cultures. The second sub-theme is geographical bias and barriers. This sub-theme specifically speaks about the geographical struggles of finding a couples counsellor that can meet people's cultural needs in their area. As you can see from the quotes, the participants associated remote area with a lower cultural awareness, which leads to reluctance to seek couples counselling. The second theme identified was LGBTQ plus specific barriers. These barriers were spoken about by 6 out of 9 of the participants. In their interviews, they spoke of several gender and sexuality specific barriers that either prevented them or discouraged them from accessing couples counselling. The first sub-theme that was identified was heteronormativity in counselling. From the quotes, we can see that the participants often felt that couples counselling was specifically designed with heterosexual couples in mind, and it made them worry that their relationship and concerns would not be understood or taken seriously within the counselling room. The second sub-theme was heteronormativity in society, which suggests that the wider societal attitude towards homosexuality could discourage LGBTQ plus couples from seeking and accessing couples counselling, as well as a link between greater acceptance and more willingness to access therapy. The third theme was intersectionality, which refers to the barriers that are often experienced by people who are part of both marginalised groups, so both cultural issues and LGBTQ plus issues. This theme was mentioned by all participants. The first sub-theme identified was wanting more related experiences and understanding from their therapist. This theme highlights participants' desire for their couples therapist to understand their cultural and LGBTQ plus experiences without the need for extensive explanation on their part, and with many of the participants valuing shared experiences of marginalization with their therapist. The second sub-theme identified was representation in advertisements and media. This sub-theme highlighted the participants' desire for more representation in media and advertisements to help them feel more included and more comfortable in accessing couples therapy. We will discuss the meaning of these results in the discussion. If we think back to our research aim, it was to find out the barriers to couples counselling for LGBTQ plus and ethnic minorities. From the interviews, we were able to conclude that the barriers included cultural and family expectations, such as stigma, privacy concerns, and the pressure to appear self-reliant, a perceived lack of cultural competence in therapists, especially in less diverse geographical areas, and heteronormativity in counselling and wider society, which led the participants to question whether their relationships would be understood and treated equally in therapy. We also found that participants highly valued therapists who could understand their intersecting cultural and LGBTQ identities without requiring them to provide extensive explanation. This highlights the importance of therapeutic rapport and intersectionality. Finally, representation of diverse identities in counselling advertisements and media influence the perception of accessibility and belonging within counselling spaces. There are, however, some limitations. Firstly, the study focuses on mainly the perceived barriers rather than the participants' actual experience of couples counselling. Expectations of heteronormativity and low cultural competence may not accurately reflect the current counselling practice and the increasing inclusivity efforts. Additionally, as this study did not adopt an experimental design, it could not determine whether increasing representation in advertising could directly improve engagement. Due to a strong emphasis on shared identity between couples therapists and clients, it may reinforce the assumption that only therapists with similar backgrounds can provide effective support. Finally, findings regarding geographical barriers might not take in consideration the growing availability of online couples counselling. So how can couples counsellors improve their practice to support this demographic of clients? There is a need for stronger intersectional and cultural competence and understanding how overlapping identities shape clients' experiences of help-seeking behaviours. Perceived inclusivity is just as important as service availability. Visible representation, inclusive language, and genuine cultural competence help reduce stigma and mistrust associated with couples therapists. On that topic, trust, rapport, and cultural humility are important aspects of successful counselling outcomes, especially for clients from marginalised communities who may fear being othered. Improving access to couples counselling requires both structural and therapeutic change. This means increasing workforce diversity and creating more inclusive counselling environments. And finally, while online counselling can improve access, it is also important to remember that it could create new barriers related to digital literacy and cultural competence. So it's important for services to ensure that remote therapy remains inclusive and accessible. So how can future research build on the current research? For starters, it could include the perspectives of both the therapists and the clients to better understand how competence is perceived and where there might be gaps in the training. There should also be further exploration on factors like migration status, religion, and socio-economic status, and how this affects help-seeking behaviours within the LGBTQ+ and multicultural communities when it comes to couples counselling. Experimental research could test whether culturally adapted therapy models, inclusive outreach, and visible representation do in fact improve engagement with couples counselling. Additionally, more research is needed on whether diverse representation among therapists and in service materials directly increases willingness to seek therapy. And finally, longitudinal and cross-cultural studies could examine how barriers to couples counselling change over time and differ between Western and non-Western contexts. In conclusion, cultural, familial, and societal expectations can significantly influence individuals' willingness to access couples counselling, with stigma and fears of judgment acting as major barriers. The perception of heteronormativity and the lack of cultural competence within counselling service reduce trust and create concerns about whether LGBTQ+ relationships will be understood and validated in counselling. Intersectionality plays an important role in shaping experiences of accessibility as participants wanted therapists who can understand both their cultural and LGBTQ+ identities. Improving access to couples counselling requires more than increasing availability, and services must actively demonstrate inclusivity through representation, cultural competence, and client-centered approaches. Finally, future research should further explore therapist perspectives, culturally adapted interventions, representation, and long-term changes in accessibility to better support marginalised communities in couples counselling. This is the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for listening.